I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Father Matthew Crane. Father Matthew was ordained a priest of our diocese in 2011, and since then he has served as a parochial vicar in 3 parishes and a pastor in 10. He is currently serving as adjutant judicial vicar for the tribunal office and vicar for canonical affairs for our diocese. He has a license in canon law from St. Paul University in Ottawa, Canada, and his presentation today is titled, Unto the Ages of the Ages, Keeping the Sacramental Records of the Catholic Church. Welcome, Father Crane.
That's a lot of pressure. Because the roadworks are what they are, I'm not going to jump right into the content just to give anybody who might be struggling to get off of the interstate a chance to get in here. I received a number of questions. I want to say up front, I received a number of questions from the registrations. There apparently was an option on the registration form to say, are there any things in particular you want answered? I've tried to weave those with artfulness and professorial humor into the presentation, but if I miss something or I don't answer it to the degree that you were expecting, we will have a Q&A after I'm done monologuing, which hopefully will be the opportunity for that to be covered, or anything else that's come up as we touch on the 5,000 different things that parish secretaries do. I have a brief story that I'd like to share about the importance of parish secretaries, not to the embarrassment of anyone here, although that might happen, but I can recall from my own childhood, growing up at St. Andrews in Elk River, how there was a sort of understanding that yes, the priest, the pastor was in charge, but golly, right after him, and sometimes perhaps alongside or even over him, was the parish secretary. You have this impression as a child. And this was really cemented for me in an incident where I was in a parish. I was serving as pastor, and it was a school day, and we have one of those schools that was the finest that could be supplied in the 1960s. And so it doesn't really have adequate storm shelter facilities in it. So the plan, in the event that there was some sort of tornado warning or the like, was if we had enough preemptive warning, we would run the kids across the parking lot from the school to the church, which had an underground facility that we could fit the whole school inside of. And they could, sit in there. Hopefully the lights would not go out, and we'd play games and sing songs until the storm had blown past. And it was after one of these particular incidents that I was hearing the stories afterward, because you always kind of do the debrief with parents and teachers to find out what were the things that the children said after they had been rushed across the parking lot, hauled underground, assured by all the adults that everything is fine as the sky is growing progressively darker and the sirens are sounding, and then had to sit through the 20 minutes or so of the tornado passing over. And one of the children reported that the lady who owns the church was kind enough to open the doors and let them in. So they were all safe, Mom and Dad, and it was fine, and you didn't need to worry about a thing. Father was there too. So remember that. The children, who see with innocence how things truly sit, recognize that it is the parish secretaries who often know what's what and are the ones who are actually running the show when it comes down to something serious like, a storm warning or whatever the case may be. One of the things that falls to parish secretaries amongst the 5,000 things is, of course, sacramental registers. And since starting as vicar for canonical affairs, I've gotten a fair number of questions about these. People are often very concerned whether or not they're doing things correctly, whether or not they're getting it right. And I fear I'm going to disappoint somewhat in the presentation today, because the reality is, although registers are very important and there are some rules around them, there are not a lot of rules around them. And there are reasons for that I'll get into. But I frequently am hearing the question, I'll get a call, what is the diocesan policy on this? Everyone is asking this all the time, including me. And often I find that the answer is that there isn't necessarily a clear diocesan policy on that particular thing. So what happens is we tend to say, well, there's got to be a rule somewhere, so we kick things up to a higher level. And we say, well, what's the church law on that? And again, my phone rings because I'm the one who gets that question. I have a license in canon law from St. Paul's University in Ottawa. Thank you for donating to the Bishop's Annual Appeal. The universal law of the church is such a vast body of knowledge, it does seem like it's going to be the source and the answer for these sorts of things. And so with great enthusiasm, as you can see there, I can comb through the books looking for answers. But we don't necessarily find any. Why is that? Because you have to remember, the universal law of the church is set up to govern the church through the whole world. So these are rules that have to equally apply and make sense here in central Minnesota and in Madagascar and Burkina Faso and Russia and China. And so if you know this, if you bore down too much and start to get into minutia and particular details, you might come up with something that's a good answer in even 90% of the cases, but not 100%. So the universal law of the church is sort of trapped into a certain ambiguity. The Code of Canon Law, merely ecclesiastical law, church law, all those fun books that were on the previous slide, those can only get you so far because they can't give too specific an answer without creating problems for somebody in some place, somewhere, at some time. So where we land, then, is on the ability we have more locally to come up with some sort of particular policy or particular law. The church has this concept of sort of two levels of law. There's what I've been referring to as universal law for, remember back there, the whole world. And then there's particular law, which would be at the level of a diocese. Or even, you can have law at the level of a parish. How exciting is that? Clearly the parish secretaries would draft that law, right? If there was law at the level of a parish. It may or may not be a surprise to some of you that in the Diocese of St. Cloud, we don't have a lot of particular law. We just don't. The Code of Canon Law, which effectively set aside most of the church's legal system that had existed prior to that from 1917. The Code of Canon Law in 1983 set all of that aside and got rid of a lot of the particular law too in various dioceses and in even some local parishes. And we in the Diocese of St. Cloud didn't wind up drafting anymore. So what we have instead are policies and guidelines. If any of you have ever seen Pirates of the Caribbean, you know that the pirate code is just guidelines anyway. So that's kind of where we've landed in the Diocese of St. Cloud. We do have a policy book. If you don't have a current copy of the policy book, you really should. You can get it by phoning up the Chancery, and they can email you a digital version, which is the coolest way to do it, because then you can put it on your phone and look it up. It's a searchable PDF. Most database software that we've got these days, even on our phones, is capable of doing at least a word search, and so you can find relevant terms. Your contact at the Chancery that I would recommend to get a copy of the policy book, the one I always use at least, is Terry Voigt. Terry, can you wave a hand, please? She's there. Okay, contact Kate. Kate will take your call, at least. But eventually, they will email a copy of the digital version to you. That way you also don't have a binder cluttering up your office. We also have sort of best practices and collective wisdom, which legally is often referred to as custom. And so this is good insofar as it's often very specific to whatever our particular situation is. It's developed out of real lived experience. This is challenging because it sometimes creates disparate answers in different parishes. And insofar as we have started to collaborate across area Catholic communities, I think this is being noticed more and more. People are saying, oh, Father told me that the answer to this or the procedure for that is such and such. And the parish right next door says, Father told me that the approach to this is such and such. And now some sort of new way has to be forged in order to make the system make sense. What I want to focus on in the conversation about sacramental registers is the baptismal register. Because this is sort of the cornerstone. I would say it is the key. And if you can understand what the baptismal register is for and how it's used in the life of the Church, you can get some guidance or make some assumptions about what the other registers might be used for, or how they would be filled out, if at all. I'll say more about that in a moment. So, these are paraphrases on the slides. These are not word-for-word copies of the canons. I will pull out the book and do some word-for-word work with a few of the canons when we go into greater detail. But for right now, when you're looking at the slides, just know these are paraphrases. So Canon 535, paragraph 1 of the Universal Law of the Church, so something that's true everywhere in the whole Catholic world. Parishes are to have parochial registers of baptisms, marriages, deaths, and other things as prescribed by the Conference of Bishops or the diocesan bishop. And Canon 535, paragraph 2 says, the baptismal register is to record confirmation, marriage, adoption, sacred orders, perpetual profession in a religious institute, and ritual ascription, all of which are to be noted on the baptismal certificate. So that seems clear enough, right? Except, do we know what all those terms are? The one that I think is going to trip some people up right away is ritual ascription. People seem relatively awake and are looking up, so I won't pick on anybody to try and push participation at this point. But ritual ascription is which of the 24 rites of the Catholic Church do you belong to? How many people in this room, this is an easy participation thing, show of hands, how many people in this room are Roman Catholics? Great. Okay, how many people are Ukrainian Catholics? Oh, no one. Maronites? Greeks? Chaldeans? No? No one? Up in Toronto, we had a lot of Ukrainian Catholics up there. These are all 24 of these different, insert adjective, Catholics, are in union with the Pope and are Catholics in the full sense of the word. But they have slightly different theological, liturgical, disciplinary, and otherwise histories, traditions that create for themselves a sort of culturally distinctive church, or what we call in Latin a church sui juris, a church in its own right. So one's ascription is which of these ritual churches do you belong to? Everybody in this room, Roman Catholic, no surprise, because that's the part of the world that we're living in. Roman Catholics are by and large the majority in North America, Central America, South America. But there are little pockets of others. The Ukrainian Catholic Church, for instance, has a huge population around Toronto, which I ran into when I was studying up in Canada. The Ukrainian Catholic Church, too, like a lot of the other non-Roman Catholic churches, promotes married men to the priesthood. So one of my classmates in Ottawa, Ksenia was her name, she got no end of glee, being a Ukrainian Catholic, she got no end of glee walking up to us Roman Catholics and saying, "Hi, my name is Ksenia, I'm the daughter of a priest." And we would go, "Oh, right. You're a Ukrainian Catholic, that's fine." So most of the time, if you look back in your baptismal registers, you're not even going to see a blank for ritual ascription. And the presumption, interpretively, is going to be that anyone in your baptismal register is a Roman Catholic. And most likely that's going to be true. But if it's not, you're going to want to make a note of this. So, the question arises, how does one get a ritual ascription? Surprising to many is it's not where you are baptized. So you don't say, "Oh, Father Matthew was baptized in the parish church of St. John the Baptist," this is true, in Brunswick, Maine, so he must be Roman Catholic because that's a Roman Catholic parish. No. You look at the father of the baptized and ask, what's the ascription of the father? So if you have a Roman Catholic father, wherever you are baptized, here or in Burkina Faso or Madagascar or Russia or China, you are, by virtue of being baptized a Catholic, ascribed to whatever your father's ascription is. Now, let's muddy the waters for just a half second here, okay? My father, at the time of my baptism, February 6th, 1984, my father at the time of my baptism was a non-practicing Episcopalian. So, what does that make my ascription? It makes it whatever my mother is. My mother, then, being the Catholic parent, it tracks her ascription, and she being a Roman Catholic, I was a Roman Catholic. There are other ways which you will likely never run into, but if you want trivia at parties, here you go, where it can be not the ascription of the father. If you have mixed ascription in the marriage, so let's say my father was not an Episcopalian but a Ukrainian Catholic at the time of my baptism. Being in North America, noting that we were probably going to go to mom's churches most of the time, they can agree to have me ascribed Roman at the time of baptism. So if there's a mutual agreement between the two parents, even though they're different, they can pick one or the other. It doesn't have to be the father's. Or, imagine if neither of your parents are Catholic. Perhaps you are baptized later, as an adult. Then you can pick. Isn't that awesome? Most people go with Roman because that's what we've got around here, okay? So that's ritual ascription. I think that's probably the only one that's a little bit odd in the listing there at 535.2. So when it comes to making records, when we're going to write down things in the baptismal register, there are a few common topics that come up. And this is where I want to dig out the code and go into this in a little bit more detail. So here is the Code of Canon Law of the Catholic Church, the world over, in a handy travel-sized volume. It's very good. Remember, on the slides I have a paraphrase. I will read to you straight from the code here that official language of the code is Latin, but I'm going to use the kind Canadian translation into English here for the purposes of this presentation. Canon 875 reads, whoever administers baptism is to take care that if there is not a sponsor present, there is at least one witness who can prove that the baptism was conferred. Let me read that again. Whoever administers baptism is to take care that if there is not a sponsor present, there is at least one witness who can prove that the baptism was conferred. A couple of things. Sponsor, in code language, is their translation of what we often refer to as godparent when it comes to infant baptism, or even adult baptism. We sometimes use this phrase, but usually with adults we'll talk about sponsors. Sponsor, godparent, these are interchangeable terms, okay? So what is 875 saying? Is it saying you have to have a godparent at a baptism? Thoughts? No, you do not. But if you don't, what do you need? A witness. Baptism is one of these sacraments that we do not repeat. Nobody talks about when I made my first baptism, okay? First communion, sure, but not first baptism. Why? Because there isn't a second one. It's done and dusted once you're baptized. So because it's a thing of lasting import, we want to make sure that it's recorded and there are people who are witnesses to it so that we know, in fact, it happened. So what does this tell us about the function of a godparent? Here's a little bit of higher level legal reasoning going on, right? If you don't have a godparent, at least have a witness. What does that tell you that godparents are at least doing? Witnessing. Bingo. So this leads to an interesting question. Can you have proxy godparents? Yes, no. So this is where it gets interesting. There's no rule in the code regarding the concept of proxy godparents, but there's also nothing explicitly prohibiting it. There's only implications, like here at Canon 875, where it talks about the witness factor, which would suggest that if someone is going to serve as a godparent, they have to be able to witness the baptism, which logically, for a lot of people, says, well, then you would have to be there, right? I mean, are you willing to be my best man at my wedding? Sure, but I have a thing that day. Can I send a proxy? Well, you're kind of the witness. You're supposed to sign the license and everything. Dude, I've got a thing, you know? But on the flip side, is there a common, refer back a couple slides in your imagination, right? Or flip back to what you've got there. Is there a common practice or custom of proxy godparents? Definitely yes. I've seen 13 parishes. I can't say in all of them, but in at least half of them, I've had proxy godparents for various baptisms at various times. So, what are the things that must be secured if one is going to have a proxy godparent? Well, I would think, and remember there are no rules here, so this is just Matthew's opinion, right? Unofficial. Okay. I would think you have to make note of who actually witnessed the baptism in the baptismal register. So it's going to get a little crowded because you'll have your godparent and your proxy and your other godparent and maybe your other proxy. But you need to have someone you can refer back to who would be an official witness. And you need their name at least in order to track it. Is that a hard and fast rule? And if you've had proxy godparents before and you didn't write it down, are you in trouble? Will the flying nuns come and lock you in church jail? No. Because there, as I said, are no rules around this in particular. But we do know that the function of the godparent is to be a witness. So somehow you need to record who witnessed the child getting splashed or dunked as appropriate. Okay? Canon 877, and I'll just read the paraphrase here. The pastor is to record without delay each baptism, Noting the name of the baptized, the minister, the parents of the baptized, the sponsors, witnesses, place and date of baptism, and place and date of birth of the baptized. Why, pray tell, dear secretaries, was that funny? This was somebody said when that was written, it didn't know the real situation. This was written in 1983. It's not that old, you know. So often this is a duty that falls to parish secretaries, in my experience. Those who've had me as a pastor or even a parochial vicar know that I was taught in seminary, Father, record the baptism before you go to bed. And so when a lot of these are happening, you know, at like 2 o'clock on a Thursday afternoon, the secretary isn't always in the office for me to say, could you do this? So I would open the safe and pull out the register and make the entry myself, and then usually leave it for the secretary to check to make sure I hadn't, you know, spelled Smith with a Y when it was supposed to be an I or something like that, you know. And I'd leave all the information sheets that I had there. And usually the secretaries found that I hadn't screwed it up too badly. They would make corrections, and then it would go back into the safe. Although the code charges the pastor with this, even the commentaries suggest that the pastor could conceivably delegate this responsibility to someone else, so long as they are literate. So it's often going to fall to the parish secretary. All of these categories are usually written out in the baptismal register across the top, or if you've got one of the fun ones that goes along the side, those are rare. You have the different things that are supposed to record. Sometimes you'll hear, or you'll see rather, the language is slightly different. For the place of birth, they might write origin. That just refers to where the child was born. Sometimes they'll have godparents instead of sponsors. Sometimes you're lucky enough to have an old enough register that'll have Latin titles in it. And you can't read it, that's right. Yeah, well, what really messes it up is when you get a geeky priest like me, who then writes the entry in Latin as well. We had a marriage register at St. Wendelin that I had no end of delight in writing place names in Latin. And then the secretary said, stop doing that. So I had to go through and add in the English and all the spots. But if you have difficulty with it, one suggestion that I would have, perhaps you've used this trick before, this is how I got through life and most of my academics, flip back to a previous page where the answers are given and look at how it's written in. Usually there's been enough of a time lag in there that somebody has written in entries in English even if the columns are still labeled in Latin. So you can find out the correspondences. But if you don't know, call me. One of the things they made me learn, because the official language of the church is Latin. So if you have a register that doesn't make sense, I'd be happy to help you try to sort it out. Plus, the power of the interwebs is very good for this too. You can Google a particular word and often it'll give you a pretty solid translation from Latin to English. 877 paragraph 2 deals with an awkward situation. The paraphrase is up on the screen there. Here's the code. In the case of a child of an unmarried mother, the mother's name is to be entered if her maternity is publicly known, or if, either in writing or before 2 witnesses, she freely asks that this be done. Similarly, the name of the father is to be entered if his paternity is established either by some public document or by his own declaration in the presence of the parish priest and 2 witnesses. In all other cases, the name of the baptized person is to be registered without any indication of the name of the father or of the parents. Sometimes when you're paging through the old registers, especially if you go back to when the entries were being made largely in Latin, but even sometimes contemporarily, because, as I said, people sometimes feel uncomfortable in these particular situations, in the blank where one or both parents' names are to be indicated, it will say the Latin word ignotus, which means unknown. When you page back through some of these baptismal registers, as one does when you don't have time, I don't know. You run across these things and start spooling out the stories in your head. Oh, look at that. Unknown. You know? The rule here, I think, is pretty clear. Basically, you write down what is publicly known or what is acknowledged by persons stepping forward. In the United States, this is not as big a deal, but it's kind of a big deal. In some other Catholic countries, it is a big deal. Anywhere where there is a concordat, a sort of treaty between the church and the local civil authorities, ecclesiastical documents often have immediate civil effects. There is a notorious story from a number of years ago about a parish in Germany where the parish secretary was asked by the mother of a child for a baptismal certificate for her child. And the parish secretary was pretty sure she knew who the father was, even though it was not indicated in the baptismal register. So she filled out a baptismal certificate indicating a particular individual as the father. That's a state document in Germany. So the mother went to court and sued the father for support. And the father said, "I'm not the father of the child," because he wasn't. And eventually proved it with a DNA test. And then sued the parish for defamation of character and a whole host of other charges, falsification of documents, etc. Our civil laws are not going to as immediately accept a baptismal certificate as testimony, but they can. I've supplied baptismal and marriage certificates to help parishioners get pensions, get travel documents, prove marriages, even prove paternity. So be careful that you keep this accurate. Sometimes saying you don't know is the most intelligent thing to do because you don't know. All right. Lastly, 8773 deals with cases of adoption. In the case of an adopted child, the names of the adopting parents are to be registered and, at least if this is done in the local civil registration, the names of the natural parents in accord with paragraphs 1 and 2, subject, however, to the rulings of the Bishops' Conference. In 1998, the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops passed supplementary legislation based on Canon 877, paragraph 3. They established the following with regard to recording the baptism of adopted children. If the baptism takes place after the adoption is finalized, the following information is entered in the baptismal register. You can write this down, but you might chuckle at yourself at the end of this, because here it is. I love how they spell this all out. The name of the child as designated by the adoptive parents, the names of the adoptive parents, the date and place of birth, the names of the sponsors selected by the adoptive parents, the place and date of baptism, the name of the minister performing the baptism, and the fact of adoption, but not the names of the natural parents. Now, if you think about it, all that's saying is treat the adoptive parents as you would treat natural parents when making the entry. And you note way at the end, where it's got notes usually or something like that in the baptismal register, adopted. That's it. One word. That's all you have to put down. Easy peasy, right? That's after the adoption is finalized. All right? So this is not inconsistent with the rest of the code, by the way, which essentially says, look, if civilly a child is adopted, in church law language, we just understand the adoptive parents to be the natural parents. It's an equivalency. and you roll with it. If baptism takes place before the adoption is finalized, the following notations are added to the baptismal register after the adoption is finalized. Now, why would that be? Why is it suddenly talking about additions to an entry that's already there? Because if the child is baptized before adoption, what's the situation? The natural parents, or at least one, presented the child for baptism, or the child's a foundling, or there's some other scenario where you may not know one or both parents, like we were just talking about. So you fall back on the rules that we had already discussed. If you have some sort of an entry and then an adoption takes place, you put parentheses around the names of the natural parents if they're recorded there, and then the names of the adoptive parents are added. The former surname of the child is put in parentheses, and the new surname is added. And then a notation is put at the end saying adopted. Does that make sense? So you just make that little addition. Yeah, I'll say it again. So you've got a baptismal entry already, and that person who's reflected there is adopted. Now you put in parentheses the natural parents' names, if they're there. Might have been a foundling, right? And then you write in, outside of parentheses, the adoptive parents' names. You put in parentheses the surname of the child, and write the new adoptive surname outside parentheses. And then you record the fact of legal adoption at the end of the entry. And here's the key rule for either scenario. Should you be, like I said, just for fun, paging through the baptismal register, writing up baptismal certificates, because you never know when you're going to need them, right? If you run across an entry that records the fact of an adoption, you do not put the fact of the adoption on the certificate. And adoptive parents are recorded as if they were natural parents. Essentially, you don't want the certificate to reflect the fact of adoption. You do not. It was the determination of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops that it would be more problematic for the child to discover he or she is adopted through the baptismal certificate than to have the potential issues around marriage scenarios or something like that, where you're saying, are you adopted? I don't know, sure, it's okay. So when you're filling out a baptismal certificate based on a record, although the register records the adoption, the certificate does not. Okay, can you hold it until we get to the Q&A at the end? Make a note to yourself. I'll try to remember to march right up to you, okay? It's a short walk on. You should be able to, okay. So, speaking of certificates, let's jump to that. We already have a rough outline of what should be on them from 535 paragraph 2, because remember it said all this stuff that's in the baptismal register should be on the baptismal certificate. Confirmation, marriage, adoption, sacred orders, perpetual profession in a religious institute, and ritual ascription. What are the first things we notice about this? The law calls for us to put what on there? And what did I just say? Don't put it on there, right? So this is a situation where locally the bishops have said, yeah, I know what the universal law says, but in our culture, in our place, in our situation, we need to adapt this. Rome approved the U.S. bishops' legislation on this. So Rome knows that we're deviating from universal law in this regard. So even though you might open up a copy of the Code of Canon Law that you have sitting around the office, and if you do, I love you, thank you for having the Code of Canon Law around your office, you'll see there that it says record adoption on the baptismal certificate. Please don't. Locally, in the Diocese of the United States, in the Diocese of St. Cloud, we don't do that, okay? What about some of these terms, though? I want to make sure we understand. Marriage, everybody here knows what marriage is, right? Some people are rolling their eyes, some people are nodding happily, yes, okay. Um, Sacred orders, what's that referring to? Priests or deacons, okay, or bishops. Bishop Neary got to go back to his home parish, right in there, ordained a bishop, February 14, 2023. That's deacons, priests, or bishops. If one of the people in your baptismal register is ordained, you make the appropriate entry. A perpetual profession in a religious institute, that's sisters, brothers, monks, religious orders. And ritual ascription, what's that again? Roman Catholic or Ukrainian Catholic or Maronite. It can change in the course of one's life. One of the common ways that it does is a marriage takes place. And then the law allows you to switch to the ascription of your spouse. In our part of the world, most people are going to be becoming Roman Catholic, and those who are, their baptismal register will not be here. So you most likely won't have to worry about it. But we're a mobile society. It's easy, to jump on a plane and fly somewhere and meet somebody and then wind up living out the rest of your life in Monaco. Now they'd still be Roman Catholic. In Eritrea. And then you need to switch to the Eritrean Catholic rite because you've married a beautiful Eritrean, handsome Eritrean, whatever the case may be. And then you might get a note from some diocese in Eritrea that says, by the way, change the ritual ascription of Bob from Roman to Eritrean. So what would you do in that situation? Besides panic and call me. Yeah, call me up, that's right. Where in most of our registers are we going to put ritual ascription? Notes at the end. That catch-all category way down at the end there. I would add it's important to have a few obvious things as well on the baptismal certificates, and often the templates have this. Notably, they don't usually have a spot for ritual ascription. So if there is a note or a change, you're probably going to have to make your own line. But most templates for baptismal certificates cover these other details. Name, dates of birth and baptism, parents' names, sponsors, or at least the witness names, the minister, the date the certificate was issued, and the signature of the one issuing, which, according to the law, is presumed to be the pastor, but could also, again, be his delegate. And it's supposed to be authenticated with the parish seal. Now, I will be honest, a lot of people I talk to are not checking for the seal or a raised seal, if there's just some little emblem of the parish on there. They say, oh, yep, look, there's a seal. But why would the date of issue for the certificate itself be important? For marriage or anything else connected to one's canonical status. The lovely, collectible, frameable certificate that's given to the parents and godparents when the child is baptized, while lovely and frameable and collectible, has only as much life information on it as when the child was baptized, which is often only a few days to a month. I was a heathen for a whole month before I was baptized. It was awesome. But then the wall came down, the parties ended, the life of prayer and penance started, as my parents brought me to the font. What's not on the frameable version of my baptismal certificate is the fact that I was ordained a deacon, the fact that I was ordained a priest, even the fact that I was confirmed. And since all of these have some bearing on one's canonical status, vis-a-vis the ability to marry, or to enter into a religious order, or really to do anything in the church, you would need to know whether or not these things have taken place. I can't tell you how many times I've received, trying to do official work in the tribunal or elsewhere, a photocopy of the beautiful, frameable baptismal certificate from the person's infancy. And I say, well, part of the reason you're here seeking an annulment is you attempted marriage at least once. That's not recorded on this. So I need something issued at least in the last 6 months. Do you have that? No. I don't necessarily. Which brings up my last point on this slide. you will get calls in your role as parish secretary from adults saying, I was baptized in your church 1,000,000 years ago. And so I'm wondering if you could find my record and issue a certificate. What are the rules around distributing baptismal certificates that some of you have, if you have any? What was it?
They only last 6 months.
They only last 6 months, right? That's a good one. What's another? Have to put notations on the back. How about who can get them? Can mom get them for a child? Yes? There's no rule one way or the other in universal law or policy. Can a neighbor get them because they're interested in finding out more about their neighbor? That does seem a little bit iffy, right? Remember, these are sensitive bits of information on this document, so please be extraordinarily careful about distributing it. The rule that I usually give is you distribute it to the person in the record, so I can get a certificate for my baptism, and no one else. The only other way you would transmit a certificate outside of your church is if you are giving it to another ecclesiastical institution. And often with the tribunal, this is what happens. People will call up and say, I'm in the process of an annulment, I'd like to have a baptismal certificate. Don't send it to me, send it to 305 7th Avenue North, Suite 101, the Pastoral Center in St. Cloud. That's fine. Or parish to parish, that's fine. But I'm doing a little family history, and I'd like to get a baptismal certificate for my great-great-aunt because it's very important for me to know her maiden name. You should be suspicious of those sorts of requests, okay? Also, obviously, make sure that these things say true information because, as I said before, they have impact. They are used often in official situations. And so we like people's travel documents or marital status or something like that to be accurately reflected on these forms. Now, what about the other parochial registers? Because remember, back at 5351, we were talking about records of baptism, marriage, death, and anything else prescribed by the Conference of Bishops or the diocesan bishop. So, to answer that question, I had looked through our policy book, see if there's anything prescribed by the diocesan bishop. I looked at the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops website, and I collected on this slide everything that the policy book says about parochial registers. Okay. Obviously, I would say you definitely have to have a baptism register. The law also, remember, talked about a register of marriages and deaths, and then left open-ended what other registers might be there. Interesting side note, I just came into this, and I found this kind of a fun trip down memory lane. If you poke around your sacristies or offices, you might find this little black thin volume. This is the Synodal Decrees of the Diocese of St. Cloud from 1939. Anybody remember that? No? Nobody here for that? In here, an official list was established in 1939 of all the parish books and records that every parish was supposed to have. So here, listen to this list. A book of baptisms. Gotcha. Book of confirmations. Okay. Book of marriages. Book of deaths of persons whose funeral services were held in the parish. Very specific there. Census records, listing all Catholics who actually or by right belong to the parish. Financial records of the parish. A parish inventory, listing all properties, movable and immovable, belonging to the parish. 138 forks, right? Insurance records, listing all policies. An announcement book, and it notes that if you have a weekly bulletin, you can just collect those, that's sufficient. A book of minutes of the parish corporation, a record of sick parishioners, a cemetery book to record all internments. So even if the funeral wasn't at your place, there's a separate book in their imagination in 39. And a parish history. Pastors are urgently requested to see that each parish have a record of its history in which data worthy of remembrance should be entered. Imagine that like a logbook, you know. That was 39. 83 code comes along, abrogated. None of this applies anymore. So we're back to the question of what should you have in there? So I asked the vicar for canonical affairs. That's me. Obviously have a baptismal register, carefully kept and preserved until Jesus returns, okay? This is where we have the record of immortal souls in the Catholic Church. If you get nothing else, if you save nothing else from the fire or the flood, if you are careful about no other registers in your responsibility, the baptismal register is the one. This is where we're tracking the live people. So get that one right. Never use whiteout in any registers you might have. All right? Never. Why? Because when Jesus comes back, the whiteout will have fallen off. We think. I actually don't know when he's coming back. Somebody will now say there was a prophecy on the 5th of October. Don't use whiteout. Don't do it. Because it falls off, and then you don't know what was the actual entry and what was not. And although it may not fall off in our lifetimes, it still will. Because I've looked back through registers where it has, you know. From the dawn of 3M Corporation, parish secretaries thought this was spiffy stuff, and they were using it. And now it's confounding us because the older records don't make any sense. Always indicate corrections by lining out the previous text so we can see what was written there, not totally covering it or blacking it out like a CIA document, but lining it out, strike through, and then writing the correct text next to it as nearly as you can. And still, it gets jumbled. Whenever you're trying to do this, you have to make the difficult mental imaginative leap of, if somebody's looking at this 100 years from now, what will make the most sense to convey the true information? And depending on the organization of your register and what the previous entry was or what the error is that you're trying to correct, that's going to require different answers at different times. But that's the point. Keep in mind practically, what can I do right now to try to anticipate what should this look like in the future so it's interpretable in a true way? And remember the overarching principle that I just mentioned. This is an immortal soul. This is their record in the Catholic Church. So treat it with the appropriate dignity and be careful about it with the care you'd have for a soul. So, if it is the record of a soul, I just want to hit a couple of these. How would you handle a request, I got this a few times, to change a godparent after baptism? You can't, is what I heard. That's correct. Yeah, because of the witness factor, right? Even if that's the brother that you had to pick because it was his turn, but you know, he never really has been in the church. How would you handle a request to have a particular record changed because their name has legally changed? What would you do? You know, there's some different answers. We don't have an overarching policy on this. We have some suggestions of one that has gone out in the diocese. What I would recommend is at least make a notation of the legal name change. I wouldn't necessarily do a correction, like a strike-through, and write a new name in there, but I would note the legal name change, because that way we can track it back. And even if you don't put that on the baptismal certificate that you issue, as long as it's in the record, if for legal purposes I or someone else is tracking it down, you'll see, oh yes, this is 2023, Bob Jones now goes by Jane Smith. So, you know, when you've got that record in there, we can sort that out as we go along. Yeah, if you put some sort of a record of when, obviously, if you're making a notation, of this name change. That's a good intervention. How about a request to totally destroy a record? No, absolutely not. Good. Okay, and I want to say a couple things quickly here about at least the confirmation register. I wrote up this slide and quickly sent it off, and I realized I didn't make it terribly clear. So let me try and say this in a different way. So on this I wrote, the confirmation registers are normally understood to be a record of confirmations in the parish in which they belong. The they there is the register. So if you have the Church of the Holy Shoulder Wound and it has a confirmation register, then you write down confirmations that took place within the 4 walls of Holy Shoulder Wound in that book. Because people will be saying, where was I confirmed? Oh, it was at Holy Shoulder Wound, so I will call them if I need to check the register of confirmations. All right? There are other practices that are out there, but this is the general interpretive assumption from the beginning. If you have a confirmation register in your parish, it's recording all confirmations which actually happened within your parish. And that might be territorial, if it didn't take place necessarily within your 4 walls, or literally within the 4 walls of the church building that belongs to the parish. Does that make sense, what I'm saying there? No. Is it that it doesn't make sense, or you disagree with it?
We disagree with it.
Okay, well, we'll get to that in just a sec. Because this is true. You know, if you look back at the history of how confirmation registers are planned out and operated, they seem to be uniformly understood as, we're recording confirmations that took place here, in the place to which the register belongs. The annual report is a different matter, all right? This is not the confirmation register. This is that statistical box on the last page. Where they're always hoping it'll all add up, you know, that part. These are the number of confirmations that took place that were received, is the way I phrased it here, by parishioners of the parish making the report. So, as often happens, 3, 4, 17 parishes will all go to one place, and the bishop will confirm all the children from all 17 parishes in some place, which for the majority of them is not their home parish, right? The fact of those parishioners of all the distinct parishes being confirmed from, the fact that they are confirmed and registered members of their distinct parishes needs to be reported to the diocese as confirmations for that parish that they belong to by reason of registration or residence, etc. So this is where you need to be careful to record all of the real confirmations of your parish members. Not necessarily in the confirmation register for your parish, but rather on the annual report. Now, is it helpful? Is it possible? Is it okay with the law that really doesn't even necessarily require a confirmation register for you to write down in your parish's confirmation register the confirmations of your parishioners wherever they might have happened? Yes, you can do that. But you're breaking from an assumption that's held the majority of the time before you. So you always have to look at those entries then and ask, was it here or was it somewhere else? More modern confirmation registers are quite helpful in this because they have place. You can tell Catholic book publishing is catching up to the situation that we're in, right? They'll have place listed for where the confirmation took place. So then you can easily distinguish with every entry. If you don't necessarily have that, you can, of course, add it in as a notation or something in your confirmation register. But I just want you to understand the general interpretive key that goes into these, all right? And then what about the register called for by Canon 958? This is the Peculiarum Librum, the special book that records all Mass stipends received, and then once the Masses are said, the fact that they're said, and then the distribution of the Mass stipend, presumably to the celebrant. This is often like just a spiral notebook in my experience, or a folder or something like that. It is theoretically subject to review by the ordinary if he should come by and say, I'd like to see your special book recording all of your masses. There's a couple of things about this that I would want to note. The main thing is the rule is not to have more than a year's worth of masses in this book at any one time. So that's always advancing by a day, right? But you look at the number of masses you can say in your parish based on your schedule, and then figure out, okay, how many can we have? How many would we cover in a year? And we're not going to have you exact down to the precise one, but you should be shooting for that all the time. And if you're realizing, especially as mass schedules draw down, you're not necessarily going to be able to make this, contact the diocese. And we can send those stipends elsewhere. We can send them to the missions, for instance. In some places in the world, this is the only source of income for priests. So it is quite welcome. And donors who might be a little bit fussy at first that it's not being said in their parish where they intended it, once they understand it's supporting a priest somewhere, they often are a little bit more open to it. Also, after a big funeral, here's 500 masses. Well, we're not going to be able to say those all in a year, so we might be able to accept 2 or 4, but the rest are going to have to go out. Why? Because we can't have more than a year on our books at any given time. I'd ask you to try to draw that down from a year and 3 months, because the idea is a year, but we can work with you. Call me, you know. Yeah. Just ring up Kate. She'll transfer you. And then what about the parish register of all you know the registered people? This is a graphic illustrating all the rules we have about that. Everything in merely ecclesiastical law and diocesan policy about parish registration forms. The question had been asked, how do we, when do we put people on an inactive list? Yes, when they're dead. That is a good time. Other than that, again, there are no overarching rules. And I understand, this is something people get fussy or upset or feel antagonized about. And so you'd like to be able to say, well, there's this rule that says we have to do it at this time. You know, you haven't shown up for 6 sequential Sundays, and so you're out. You know, or something like that. You don't use your envelope for 3 years, 5 years, whatever. I understand there isn't, I'm sorry, there just isn't. There isn't. And I hope you can understand why. Because what makes sense here might not make sense in Madagascar or Burkina Faso. If we try to develop something as a diocese, I think you're going to find that it's a fight between the more and less rural parishes that have larger and smaller numbers. I could tell a funny story about that, but I'm running out of time. So I would say, you know, use your best judgment, and don't be afraid, even though it does provoke some, you know, several days of nasty phone calls, to send out a mailing that says, look, we've noticed that you, along with several others, have been inactive for a long time, and we're just wondering, do you want us to keep you on the active list, or are you sick of getting our mailings? I note that your address is in Sacramento, or whatever. And they may call you up and say, how dare you say that I'm not active and blah, blah, blah. Well, you're not, you know, it seems like a legitimate question. Okay, keep that in the active box, all right. But if they don't answer, or they might even call back and say, yes, thank you, I was getting around to that, you have cleaned up your records just that much. So thicken one's skin, make the move. It is good to try to audit these things every once in a while. Now, there was a question here about something related to baptism, as I recall. All right, because I'm recording this for posterity, way for posterity, I'm going to hold up the microphone so we can hear the question, okay?
It was just, so we only would know that they were adopted if the adopted parents came and told us. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, there's no way for us to know, right? Like, we don't have to follow up on people who are baptized.
So you're asking, when do we call in the canon law police to investigate the claims of parents? Yeah, there is essentially a trust factor that's operating here. That's very true. And that's true for many, many things in the church. If you, as parish secretary, the lady who owns the church, are aware of something, it is important for you to point that out. Without fail, I have ceased to be pastor in a number of locations, and within 3 to 6 months, someone will call me and say, Father, did you know so-and-so is in an irregular marriage, and they've been an extraordinary minister of Holy Communion forever and a day. Well, why didn't you tell me that during the 6 years I was your pastor? I have to go. If you know something, say something. It's like the old TSA deal, right? You know, if you are aware of something in your role, please inform the pastor so that we can try and sort this out to help people. So if you know something funny is going on, direct the appropriate authorities. But if you don't know, yeah, we just trust. The only way we'd be able to figure it out is if they told us. I'm going to go here just because it's closer and yeah.
I just have a quick question about what people do with registered people. For instance, so after the kids are confirmed at a later age, or once they graduate high school, so do people have them fill out forms that they're registered, or do they just kind of slide in because they were born into the church? Like we have lifelong members, but then they might go off to college, and then you lose track. When do they become a registered member, and how do you do it?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. There are no particular rules, and the background of that is this fact that I imagine a shock even to many of the people in this room. Registration has nothing to do with your actual membership in a parish. Right? Legally, this is an absolutely true statement. One's membership in a parish is determined by your address. Parishes in the Diocese of St. Cloud, with the exception of the Christ Church Newman Center, are territorial parishes. Every single parish has a territory, it has boundaries. Even if you don't know them, they're on a record somewhere, and the people inside those boundaries belong to your parish, whether you like them or not, whether they're Lutheran or not, whether their address makes them your parishioners. Registration is a tool to figure out who your people are so you can communicate with them easily. So use it in that way. If it's most appropriate to have the kids, once they're confirmed, file as adults on their own in their own household, go for it. If that doesn't make sense, don't. You know, it's best practices for your particular locale. It's a good question. There's no binding rules because registration is just simply not addressed. The way the church organizes herself is, she says, we have a mission to only the whole world, so we'll cut it up into pieces. And the people who are inside that piece, this is the pastor, this is the bishop, this is the pope for that piece. Go. And that's how it operates. Does that make sense? Yeah, okay. Yes?
I have a baptism question.
Yes.
So witness sponsor, do they have to be Catholic?
This is an excellent question. So this is getting to godparent rules. Do the witnesses or sponsors have to be Catholic? To be a sponsor or to be a godparent, one does need to be a Catholic. Yes, one needs to be fully initiated, not subject to any ecclesiastical penalty, a practicing Catholic who's living the faith in a way that will be demonstrative and helpful to the person baptized. One can have a baptized non-Catholic. Do you understand what I'm saying there? So a baptized person who is not a Catholic serve as what's called a Christian witness, but only with a godparent or sponsor. So you can't just have a Christian witness. Now, remember 875, you can just have a witness. So if the Lutheran is the only one you can grab, I'm about to baptize this kid, okay? They're on the list. But their role is not understood to be that of a godparent. And that leads to a broader reflection of what are the distinctions then between those roles. And we could talk at length about that, I think, and have a whole other symposium. But that's a thing to work out in your own understanding. Okay, you've been very patient. Yes. Into the microphone for posterity.
Talk about a child who's baptized in a Lutheran church and then comes into the Catholic church and receives First Communion and is confirmed.
Okay.
Where does that fit in your baptism?
Good question. So this is the classic scenario, especially if you have a school. Second grade rolls around and little Timmy was baptized as Lutheran because that's what the parents or one of the parents were at the time or still are, and it was more convenient because they had a Saturday opening or whatever the reason was. Timmy's baptized as a Lutheran. But parents have put him in the Catholic school since kindergarten. And all of a sudden it's second grade, and we ask for baptismal certificates, and Timmy's comes in as Lutheran. What do you do? Various disciplines have been utilized in the Diocese of St. Cloud, various customs. I've heard it said different ways. I've heard it said when the children make the profession of faith at the First Communion Mass, that is the profession of faith in the Catholic Church for little Timmy. And so you just treat him as a Catholic, you give him First Communion, and you write up a baptismal entry for him saying, made profession of faith with First Communion Mass, etc. Another route, which you can use but kind of gets you to the same result, is the discipline in the Diocese of Bismarck. They wrote up a nice little addenda to canon law, particular law for their diocese, which says, if a child is below the age of reason, that is age 7 or under, and their parents make some indication that they want the child raised as a Catholic, such as putting them in a Catholic school, then you can ascribe that child to the Catholic Church just by virtue of the parent making that choice for them if they are already baptized. Does that make sense? So they're baptized as a Lutheran, but now their parents are saying, no, we actually want Timmy to be Catholic. Okay, done. Make a baptismal entry for Timmy, recording where he was actually baptized, that his parents decided he was going to be Catholic from here on out, and then he makes his First Communion along with everyone else. When the child is over the age of reason, 7 or older, and mature enough to demonstrate it, then what we're asked to do is follow the children's rites in the book that's called The Rite of Christian Initiation of Adults, which makes it seem very inappropriate for this, but follow the children's rites for entrance into full communion of the Catholic Church. I've done this a few times as a priest. Basically, it gives the child a little bit more ownership over the choice and says, hey, your parents are interested in you becoming Catholic. Can I teach you a little bit about what that means? They make a little profession of faith in a very private ceremony, so they're not scared, sometimes with their school classmates around them. And then you, again, make a baptismal entry, recording where they were actually baptized, when they made the profession of faith, and under what circumstances, and then any other information as it comes in. I'm afraid I've gone over my time, so I can't take any more questions at this point. I need to let you at least have a break, and then I will turn it over to the illustrious Father Tom Knobloch.